All right, why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and on behalf of Frontier View, thank you for joining our webinar series. On today's webcast, we will be diving into how multinationals can prepare for an uneven recovery in Asia Pacific. And over the course of the next 60 minutes, we'll be taking a deep dive into two primary topics. First, what are the timelines for recovery in the region, including timelines for border reopening? And then secondly, what is the current state and outlook for the shipping and logistics sectors given their importance to recovery? As always, we'll examine these topics through the lens of how to best prepare your business. By way of introduction, my name is Richard Leggett. I'm the CEO of Frontier View, and I'm excited to be moderating this timely discussion. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Adam Jarzik, Frontier View's Managing Director for Asia Pacific. Adam and I would like this to be an interactive discussion, so please be sure to click on the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen and send your questions to Frontier View webinars, and we'll work to get as many questions included in the discussion as possible. Also, as a reminder, if you are a client, you can access all of our Asia Pacific market intelligence research and data on your Frontier View desktop and mobile applications by simply logging on. However, if you're not a client, for registered attendees of this webinar, we're offering complimentary trial access to Frontier View for a short period of time. To take advantage of this offer, please request a trial in the comment box or visit our website at www.frontierview.com, click the request trial button, or you can scan the QR code and do it that way as well. Before we get started, we realize that some of you may be new to Frontier View, so I'd also like to take a minute to provide you with a quick overview of our firm and how we support multinational executives. Frontier View is a premier global market intelligence and advisory firm, and our primary focus is on serving the market intelligence needs of global business professionals at multinational corporations by informing and powering their market monitoring, strategic planning, and international growth priorities. From the beginning, we built Frontier View to be different in three primary ways. First, our product and service model, which has been purpose-built to serve a global business audience. In every aspect of our work, we strive to separate signal from noise and answer what we call the so what, now what questions that are unique to the international business professional. The second differentiator is our model. We call that strategic intelligence as a service. Frontier View is the only market intelligence solution that bundles together information resources, access to our analysts, and a senior executive network into one affordable subscription. And finally, we are especially proud of our world-class technology. Our world-class technology powers the Frontier View desktop and mobile application, and it's been built with the sole purpose of informing our clients' workflows and decision processes. We're incredibly proud of our client base, which today includes a community of over 4,000 professionals across 240 companies, and it's growing. Some of the companies and logos you see here. And again, if you're not a client and are interested in receiving trial access, please visit our website and click on the request trial button. All right, commercial over, let's get started. Having briefly introduced our company, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenter. Adam Jarzik is Frontier View's Managing Director for Asia Pacific. Many of you know Adam. He leads our Asia Pacific research practice, and he's a true expert on the region. Adam, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Rich. It's a pleasure to be here.
If we could, I'd like to break our discussion into two main topics. First, any outlook discussion, I think, needs to start first with an understanding of recovery timelines, where we currently stand and what we can expect. And then secondly, let's dive a bit deeper into shipping and logistics in the region, given some of the bottlenecks that we're seeing. And we choose this topic as a deep dive for two reasons. First of all, it's top of mind for our clients. We're having these conversations almost every single day. And secondly, understanding shipping and logistics, I think, will help us better understand true recovery timelines. So they're interwoven, and it'll be good to dive into both of these. Does that sound like a good plan?
Absolutely.
All right, let's get started. So, Adam, I want to kick off. Last week, we held one of our senior executive roundtables, and you had an interesting group of executives that were essentially representing all sectors of the global economy in the room, and you posed a question to them, and we'll share. You posed a number of questions, and we'll share these as we go through. But one of the first questions you posed to them was really about how aligned did they feel their companies were about all of the assumptions around COVID recovery and all of the specifics around all the underpinnings of that. And I thought the results there were fascinating, and I thought maybe you could walk us through them.
Absolutely. So The session that we held last week was really fascinating because we had so many presidents of Asia Pacific in the room together, in the virtual room together. So these are the individuals who are basically tasked with aligning with corporate as well as with country level organizations to drive a unified strategy forward. And as a result, are really best placed to understand alignment across an organization. This is something we spend quite a bit of time speaking with our clients about. And in this case, we wanted to know how aligned these individuals who are in a prime position to evaluate this, how aligned they felt their organizations were with regards to basic assumptions about COVID. What the vaccine situation looked like, whether the different variants would cause huge problems, what sort of government policies to expect, and the results were notable. What we saw is that around 80% of the executives whom we surveyed effectively said their organizations were not aligned. That conversations had either taken place independently at different levels of the organization, or that conversations had taken place informally, but that there was no aligned view. This is kind of problematic. Actually, it's hugely problematic because our research has demonstrated quite conclusively that organizations that are aligned internally, different levels, see substantive results, both on the top and bottom line. And particularly given the uncertainty and volatility inherent in today's marketplace, this is an area where organizations have the potential to really gain a competitive advantage.
Well, clearly, I think this is a complex topic, and the sentiment of those executives that you were in the room with, the virtual room last week, is probably not isolated just to the APAC region. I mean, we're hearing this all around the world. It's a complex issue. It's got many uncertainties. And I know that you and your colleagues on the Frontier View research team have been trying to work on, it's a challenging topic for us too. And you guys have been working on an interesting framework, I think, to help us underpin and create a baseline view for this year and essentially 2022 as well. Maybe as a good starting point to help some of our clients achieve alignment, we start with just talking about this framework and some of our underlying base assumptions and some of the variables, and then from there we can kind of translate what that means to the market outlook.
Absolutely. It's actually notable that we also dealt with similar organizational issues when it came to alignment. Now, what we found as the COVID situation emerged was that we constantly had to be in communication with one another to try to figure out what was going on, because what was happening in Asia was happening in North America and Europe, and vice versa. And so but what we found was that very often we ended up speaking past one another, and some of those gaps grew, particularly as vaccine rollouts began and the fire hose of information just grew ever thicker and stronger. And so we got together as an organization, as a research organization, and outlined the assumptions that we had to make in order to ensure that we were not speaking past one another. And the result of that exercise is here on this slide. Apologies for the small print, but we had to find a way to fit 14 assumptions onto a single slide. You'll see that there's all sorts of information on here that we don't actually effectively know, that we have to basically take a view on and then wait for additional information to confirm. This is indicative of the sheer level of uncertainty that exists in the marketplace today. So many people, I think, I'd include myself in this bucket, really wanted to believe that 2021 was not going to be as uncertain or as volatile a year as 2020, that somehow we'd return to normal. But the reality of the situation is that, well, it may not be quite as volatile or disruptive as 2020. 2021 is nevertheless going to be an extraordinarily uncertain and potentially very volatile year, and that very well may spill over into next year, which is one of the reasons why alignment is so important right now.
Okay. Do you want to highlight any specific assumptions here, or we'll share these materials and folks can take a look at them, but maybe we should, let me know if you do. If not, we can move on to kind of what this means in terms of our base case view.
So I'll highlight a couple of these later on in the presentation. I think that Just wait for them to come through. You'll see particularly the item about immunity coming from vaccines, or ability to spread the virus coming from vaccines, and the herd immunity threshold as well.
Okay, well, why don't we'll jump to the punchline, which is kind of the first punchline, which is what is our outlook for recovery across the various markets in Asia Pacific, and also for this next year, but also when you see markets recovering to pre-COVID levels.
Yeah. So usually when people evaluate this question, they look at it from the perspective of growth, right? So what you have here is a series of economic growth projections that we've developed for major markets around Asia Pacific. You'll see we have historics for 2019, in some cases historics for 2020, in some cases those numbers are still coming through, but 2021 definitely forecasts. And what you'll note here is that the green bars representing 2021 growth forecasts are all in positive territory. And in fact, in some cases, are very well into positive territory. The headline numbers look good, but they can also be a bit deceiving because of something called base effects. When last year's growth rates were really, really bad, it ends up exaggerating this year's growth rates, which is why if you look at, say, India and the Philippines, two markets which are expected to grow at very high rates this year, they're preceded by, their growth numbers are so high, at least in part because the dark blue bars are so bad, they're so far in negative territory. And so to remove this, this potential bias in the information, we find it helpful to talk about indices, which is what we do on this chart. So what you see here is a quarterly GDP index where we benchmarked every country to the end of 2019, basically pre-COVID levels. And then we map out on a seasonally adjusted basis how those economies have recovered since. And what we see is a pretty clear divergence between various markets. So China, Australia, Vietnam, they've already rebounded. They're back in positive territory. South Korea is well positioned to rebound fully to pre-COVID levels in the middle of this year. There's other markets like Indonesia, for example, Japan. They're poised to reach pre-COVID levels towards the end of this year, but just barely. These stand in stark contrast to, say, the Philippines and Thailand, who have experienced a substantial amount of damage and won't recover until at least 2022. Now, there's one thing I want to add here, which is that these lines change. They shift due to developments in international markets. So, for example, Malaysia, up until the end of last year, was slated to recover along the same lines as South Korea. But then Malaysia had a massive outbreak. They had to lock down. They had real trouble in containing it, and that's why Malaysia's line has dropped dramatically, and we do not expect the country to recover this year.
And this is a chart that you'll dynamically kind of keep updated for our clients.
Absolutely.
Kind of exchange.
Every
yeah.
month,
So
it looks just a little bit different.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and so I think also underpinning this and tied back to our framework diagram, understanding recovery timelines also requires a deeper understanding of government policy towards the pandemic and vaccine rollout, as well as understanding the supply side of the equation, the vaccine supply side of the equation. And so I thought we could dive deeper into each of those kind of on a market by market basis, starting with government policy, and then we'll come back around and we can look at supply side of it with the vaccine.
Certainly. So when it comes to government policy, the situation is quite complex. Every day we're getting different news about different countries implementing different actions in order to contain an outbreak or potentially to loosen up some sort of restrictions that were put in place previously to bring numbers under control, but are now being eased. And it's really challenging to just pull all of that together into some sort of cohesive, understandable framework. But that's basically what we decided to do on a global level to try to get a sense for how different countries are approaching this incredibly challenging dynamic. And so what we did is we basically broke countries into three groups. You'll see the buckets listed here. The first group, going from left to right, is the virus tolerant, or countries taking a virus tolerance strategy. These are countries that either because they don't think that they can make a difference or because they don't really think that the cost is worth the benefit, have chosen to basically let the virus ride. They may put in place a lockdown here or there. They may put in place some sort of policy to drive social distancing, but by and large, they're letting it be what it's going to be. And in these markets, while the governments will pursue vaccination, the urgency isn't necessarily there because, ironically, while people are feeling substantial health consequences, by and large, they're not feeling as many of the economic consequences, unless they're heavily reliant on tourism. The second bucket of countries are those who are taking a virus reduction strategy. So these are countries that reject the virus tolerance approach and say, look, there are competing priorities here on the health and the economic side. We got to find a way to balance these out. And so these are countries that engage in what we usually call as the dance. They're trying to manage the virus. So when numbers come up or go up, they put in place measures to bring them under control, but impact the economy negatively. When numbers come down, they loosen things up. And so there's this ebb and a flow and up and a down, and it's a really difficult political balance to strike. So these governments tend to have a driving need to vaccinate their population. The politicians don't want to continue being blamed for really difficult economic situations due to lockdowns on the one hand or rising cases on the other. It's a very uncomfortable position for them to be in. The third bucket of countries are those who are taking a virus elimination strategy. These are countries who are taking cases to zero. The goal is to lock down the borders and to ensure that the virus does not come in. And if it ever does, through whatever means it does, then the authorities move aggressively to lock down whatever they need to lock down to bring cases to zero. This is not about hospitalizations. It's not about ICU beds. It's not about the numbers that are usually tracked in markets in North America, actually in the Americas and Europe. This is all about destroying the virus within your borders. What's notable about this is that all of the countries who are taking that third approach are in Asia Pacific, all of them. Across the rest of the world, countries are taking either a virus reduction or tolerance strategy, which yields some pretty interesting conversations because individuals who have never been to some of these markets that are pursuing a virus elimination strategy at times find it inconceivable that a government would or even could do what they've done. There are unquestionably pros and cons to all of these approaches. I'm not advocating for any one, but it does create some very interesting challenges when it comes to internal communication.
Let's look at the supply of the vaccine, the supply side of the vaccine on a country by country basis for the region as well then.
Absolutely. This is important, right? Because you can have the best intentions in the world, but if you don't have the vaccine supply, it doesn't really make a difference. So this is a lot going on in the chart that you see on this slide, but it really does sum up the situation quite well. Let me explain. Basically what we've done here is we've looked at a variety of different markets around Asia Pacific, and we have charted out what percent of their population they can cover with publicly reported purchases. These are actual purchases and purchases of options. But in all cases, the ink is dry and the agreement has been publicly announced. What you see here, basically the, incidentally, quick note, percent of population covered is utilized to normalize across vaccines that only require one shot and vaccines that require two. What you'll notice here is that there's a huge amount of variation in terms of population coverage. So New Zealand, Australia are able to cover their entire population based on the purchases that they have made over 2.5 times. In New Zealand, it's over 3.5 times due to a massive uptick recently in Pfizer purchases. They are far and away the most covered markets. Well behind them, but leading the rest are the other major developed markets of Asia Pacific, South Korea, Japan, which are reasonably well covered. And then as you go down the list, you'll see a variety of other markets, many of the developing markets pretty low down. Now, let me offer a few caveats on this. It may shock you that China is so low. The reason China is so low is not because we don't think that they have supply, but because they haven't announced any purchases. But China has, we believe, enough production to cover its population. China should be fine. You also note that Singapore is not on this list. Singapore has not announced any of its purchases in terms of at least the number of doses that it's procured. It has simply said, here are the companies we're buying from, we've got this, we'll get you vaccinated on a specific timeline. So you got to choose to either accept that or not believe it. It's really up to you. We're choosing to believe it because there's a lot of downside risk associated with the government not hitting its timelines. But that glaring absence usually raises questions. So I did want to note that specifically.
And Adam, just before we move on to the next slide, just how do you see this changing over time? In other words, there's obviously a certain limitation to how much can be produced by each manufacturer. And so does this picture kind of hold similarly for if you project out 3 to 6 months, or will we see the countries that are lower down on this chart start to catch up in terms of the supply side?
So first of all, Australia and New Zealand do not need enough vaccine to cover that entire portion of the population. I think that in some cases, the reason they bought so much was to get ahead of potential failures, right? Canada, for example, bought, I think, enough vaccine to cover 6 times their population. So, we would expect them to vaccinate. What?
Might we see a bit of a redistribution, therefore, once their own countries are taken care of, back to some of these countries that desperately need it?
I would expect so. It probably won't just be limited to Asia Pacific, though. And what I would expect to see, difficult as it may be to acknowledge, is that the markets that control supply will take some of that for themselves. Probably not all of it. Like India will almost undoubtedly take some for themselves, but not cut off the rest of the world. And you'll see other markets that are wealthier manage to secure supply potentially at higher prices, potentially because they've already been in talks well in advance with the vaccine producers. The less wealthy markets who have not gotten ahead of this are going to have a really hard time catching up to the more developed markets because they don't have the money, they haven't been in talks, they don't really have the wherewithal to get the vaccines to market in the same way that many of the other markets do. So I would expect this broad pattern to be sustained over the course of the next 3 to 6 months, although the shapes and the colors on these bars will probably change.
Okay. Can we now bring the two dimensions that we just talked about, the government approach and the vaccine supply and rollout, to get a sense of herd immunity timelines for each market?
Absolutely. That's exactly what my team did. So we have a team of analysts who are covering these markets on an ongoing basis who really understand the nuances associated with government policy, as well as some of the details of the supply constraints and supply contracts. And so we brought these factors together along with their detailed knowledge and basically pulled together the rough timelines to reach herd immunity that you see on this slide. Now, Rich, you asked earlier about key assumptions off of that list of 14 items earlier on. Here's a key assumption. We are asserting that 80% of the population needs to get fully vaccinated to reach herd immunity. This is due to certain assumptions about the infectiousness of the most prominent variants now, as well as some essential epidemiological equations utilized to calculate herd immunity.
And Adam, just to clarify, is it 80% needs to be vaccinated, or 80% needs to either have the antibodies because they've contracted the virus and or been vaccinated?
Great question. So technically, based on the epidemiological equation that we used, it's 80% need to be immune either due to vaccination or due to infection. Here's the challenge, though. If we look across the vaccines in the market, aside from Pfizer and Moderna, the efficacy rates there are low enough that you really have to vaccinate a substantial portion of the population, or a larger portion of the population, to reach the level that you would want. And so this 80% level basically takes that into account. I mean, if you take some of the prominent vaccines globally and you look at what percentage of the population would need to be vaccinated to reach 80%, it's over 100%, right, of the entire population. So this is our way of kind of balancing that out and at least giving some sort of standard baseline globally. Because reaching 80% of the population is quite a challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, logistically, it's a huge challenge.
Absolutely.
Okay, so so then that leads to the next question, which is about border reopening. And it was interesting. So in our session last week with our executives, you asked our client executives when they expect various borders to reopen. What was their perspective? And then we'll talk about our perspective.
Yeah. So we asked the question, and we didn't just ask when do they expect. We actually said, what internal timelines are you using in your organizations for border reopenings, for your planning, right? And there was a very clear answer. 80% of the executives said Q4 of this year, that is what our organizations are using as our internal timelines for travel to restart. What you'll see over the course of the coming slides is very interesting about this, is that this answer, this response, as well as the conversations that tend to take place around it, reflect a bias, a mismatch between assumptions that executives say they have and assumptions that they're actually using internally. We'll show you what that looks like in just a little bit.
Okay, and I think then the border reopening itself is a complex topic. Involves both business travel and tourism. So I think you have some definitions and assumptions. Maybe we could talk a little bit about those.
Yeah. So so I got my team together, right? And we sat down to talk about these border opening timelines. And I got to be frank, I thought this was going to be a 30 to 60 minute exercise. It was a 5-hour exercise, the entire team talking this out. And the reason it was so challenging was because, once again, we found that we were speaking past one another. Some people were making assumptions about certain things that didn't match with other people's assumptions. And so we really had to come together and identify the baseline assumptions and definitions that we were going to use. So I mentioned before, there was a key assumption here. We've highlighted it in this case. This notion that vaccinated people can still spread the virus at the same rate, approximately the same rate as those who are not vaccinated, this is a critical assumption. And it's the one that a lot of people are not thinking about, because as per the WHO's current guidance, as per the guidance of prominent epidemiologists in a variety of major markets around the world, we should not be assuming anything else, but many people are. And this came out clearly in the conversations that we had. Additionally, we had to have conversations about what open borders meant, what a vaccine passport was. We had to make some assumptions about different elements there. So briefly, when we say open borders, we're saying basically here that vaccinated business people are allowed in either without quarantine or with a minimal quarantine, right? If you still have to quarantine for 14 to 21 days, then the borders aren't really open if you're vaccinated. Yeah. The other one that was a key point is vaccine passports. You know, there are a lot of markets that are throwing around this notion of vaccine passports, but only domestically. So you hear China, for example, talk a little bit about that, but they're talking about it domestically as a passport for internal travel. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but when we're talking about it, we're talking about international borders. So this is, when we say vaccine passports, we're talking about official documentation that is recognized by an international, albeit limited, consortium of markets that confirms vaccination status and allows individuals who are based in one country to go visit their organizations in another country. A couple of additional items here, just in terms of the assumptions. We are saying here that vaccinated people, if it becomes clear that vaccinated people don't spread COVID, i.e. that assumption that I showed in the last slide is wrong, that happens in Q2. The WHO revises its guidance then, and that vaccine passports as a result start to be issued in Q3.
Okay, so that leads to the natural question: when do you expect each country to open its borders based on at least our current thinking and baseline assumptions and models?
Yeah, so let me show you. We actually have two slides here. Let's operate, as we said before, on the assumption that individuals who get vaccinated can still spread the virus. if that's the case, then it doesn't matter whether you've been vaccinated or not vaccinated. You're still a threat for spreading the virus to countries. And so countries are going to be much more reticent to open their borders to you, regardless of your vaccination status, unless their population is protected, right? So basically, exactly, herd immunity, exactly. Which is one of the reasons why those timelines we showed earlier are so important. So you take a look at this chart, you'll see here countries moving from borders being closed to borders being open with some evidence of vaccination. I'll explain that in a second. And then to borders being open entirely. There are some markets that we believe are going to open before they reach herd immunity because the timelines are so distant that they're not going to be able to wait. In many cases, they're taking a virus tolerant strategy anyway. So, I mean, honestly, it's not as big of a deal for them. And then in some cases, they're going to require some evidence of vaccination on the hopes that, vaccines help to some degree, but they're only going to accept the vaccines that they want to accept, and they're only going to accept evidence from countries that they believe are able to really properly validate. So that's why you see some of the variation across markets. But I just want to highlight here, if we look back at the survey results, executives are saying, well, we're planning for Q4 of this year to be able to travel all over the place. Okay, well, fair enough. But what we're saying is if we take the WHO's current guidelines and we keep them through the end of this year, then you're unlikely to be going to Australia, Korea, China, or Japan, as well as a variety of other markets. So you may want to really take a close look at your plans. Now, you may very well say, well, okay, but I don't buy the WHO's guidelines. Okay, that's fair, right? Then let's be upfront about it. Let's make sure that we're all aligned about that. Because if that's the case, then those timelines look much more realistic. Countries are going to be open borders much sooner if they're confident that vaccines prevent transmission. And this is where vaccine passports really come into play. You have some markets that will open up no matter what. Once again, vaccine tolerance, or excuse me, virus tolerance countries. You have others that are going to want to see evidence of vaccination from authorities that they trust, and they'll want to see vaccines that they trust as well. So the entire situation looks a little bit thorny. As an example, you'll notice that China has some asterisks on it. Why? Because China's willingness to open up its borders to individuals who are vaccinated from other markets depends on those countries' willingness to open their borders to Chinese business people who have been vaccinated with Chinese made and developed vaccines, right? So China's basically saying, look, if I vaccinate someone with Sinovac or Sinopharm, then you need to let my people in the same way that if you vaccinate with AstraZeneca or Pfizer or Novavax or another one, that you're asking me to let your people in. And those conversations can be a little political and a little bit thorny. So even looking at these timelines on this chart, we're not suggesting that all these markets are going to be open to you as soon as Q4 rolls around. There's probably going to be some complexities to manage and navigate here.
We've gotten like a couple of questions on this topic from our audience, so I want to weave them in before we move on, if it's okay. And I think you've touched on it a little bit, but just to give you a chance to kind of make the fine point here. So the first question is that our current assumptions, or the current assumptions we're using here, seem based on how much vaccines the countries have been able to procure and how they'll vaccinate in this round. And the question is, do we have any clue on how long vaccines will hold immunity? You guys are really stretching the limits of our expertise here, but any clue on how long vaccines will hold immunity and remain efficacious? Because that, to some extent, will indicate how long borders will stay open and markets recovery can be sustained. So that's the first question. Then I have a follow-on. Okay,
let me address that real quick. Truth of the matter is, we don't know. And Rich is right. You are kind of stretching the boundaries of our epidemiological knowledge. However, having said that, nobody knows the answer to that question, which is actually why it made it onto our assumption list. If you can squint and look at the text on your screen, the top item on or under the immunity category is immunity lasts for at least 8 to 12 months, whether from infection or vaccine, regardless of the vaccine type. This is an arguable point, and we recognize that. But if you don't make this assumption, then vaccinations basically go out the window until we can find some sort of technology that will allow for it. Because countries aren't going to just be able to vaccinate every 6 months on a rolling basis. At that point, the entire situation falls apart. And you got to wonder whether many countries just become virus tolerant or to start taking a virus tolerant strategy.
Okay, and then the second question was different countries are using different vaccines. That was the chart we showed before, and in some cases those are which are not legitimate in other countries. You hinted at this maybe with the China Sinovac vaccine. So I guess the question there is, how do you see travel being allowed or not being allowed based on the type of vaccine you had, and how can you even prove what type of vaccine you've had?
Yeah, so let's take the second half of that question first. The entire point of the vaccine passport is to have some sort of credible documentation, whether it's an actual booklet or whether it's on your smartphone, that is accepted across a consortium of markets. Not everybody is going. I find it difficult to see the entire world getting on board with a platform in the short term. There's simply too many complexities at play, and there's too much risk of fraud. So what you're likely to see is a consortium of markets, probably many of the developed markets that have long-standing ties to one another and a great deal of trust, beginning to work with one another first, and then other countries kind of coming into it. So the EU, for example, has I don't understand it fully, but they have a program that they're developing for the common market in order to allow movement across borders. That's been cited as one potential source of standards for vaccine passports. Other countries could basically say, hey, EU, I really like what you've done there. Can we get in on this? And what do we need to do to be part of this? There's also certainly ongoing discussions between countries that are traditionally linked, say Commonwealth countries, that have the potential to turn into something. But ultimately, what's likely to happen is some group of countries is going to pull together some sort of not coalition, but consortium and have standards, and everybody else has to buy into those standards. With regards to the types of vaccines that are included, I mean, it depends on which markets you're talking about. Since the EU is quite heavily reliant on, say, Oxford AstraZeneca, I'd expect that to be prominent there. Same thing, actually, probably in any sort of consortium that involves the UK, Singapore, ANZ, probably the US as well. There's probably be some questions about Pfizer and Moderna making their way in, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that be the case. The real questions are going to arise around biotech, CanSino, Gamaleya, Sinopharm, Sinovac, those vaccines. It's tough to say at this point. I think to a large degree, to come back to the first part of your question, it's going to depend on what the data says. We're all wading through an incredibly murky situation, trying to get our heads around a really complex topic. And without data, it's really hard to point to anything. But with some data, we can at least begin to make educated policy decisions, albeit ones that involve some risk to move forward.
Okay, one more question. I know we want to get to the shipping topic, and there's 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure we dive into that. So I'm just going to ask one more here, and maybe we'll skip ahead a couple of slides. But question from our audience: how do your assumptions change if people choose not to vaccinate, and therefore it's harder to get to that herd immunity? So in certain markets, like Hong Kong was an example where vaccine uptake has been very slow. And if you have a chunk of the population that just isn't comfortable taking the vaccine, how is that covered in your base assumptions?
That's a great question. So in some cases, vaccine uptake, like in Hong Kong, for example, is a bit political, and it's an issue of trust and transparency. Some people may not agree with that explanation, but what I mean by that is, if Hong Kong went out and bought a lot of the questions around Hong Kong's vaccination, at least based on my understanding, have to do with Sinovac, less so than vaccines in general. Whereas in some other markets, there's just a general pushback against all vaccines. The reason it's important to differentiate between these two is it's a lot easier to overcome the first obstacle than the second. With the first obstacle, you just need to buy a different vaccine. For the second obstacle, you need to change hearts and minds, and that's tough. If we see serious challenges associated with getting to the 80% herd immunity benchmark, which could arise in a variety of different markets, then many of them developed, incidentally, then we would see herd immunity timelines extend. So basically, these timelines would extend for those markets, and we would likely see those markets be cut out of, we would likely see a great deal of reticence for countries who have not reached herd immunity to allow their people to travel to those markets without substantial quarantine. Vaccine passports would still work. People who are in those markets who have the vaccines, if the WHO changes the guidelines, would still be able to travel out and travel back. But it would be a country that was trying to reach herd immunity and has closed off its borders would be very hard pressed to open up its borders to another market that was really delaying vaccination or saw delayed vaccination timelines. So it just has the potential to create more complex dynamics around trip planning, more challenges associated with managing a portfolio, and frankly speaking, just more uncertainty longer term about where and how you can manage your teams and businesses.
Okay. Keep the questions coming. If we don't get them woven in here, we will follow up and make sure that you receive answers in the follow-up. But I want to shift now to the second topic, which is around shipping and logistics. So we're going to skip ahead a little bit. And I'm kind of here. We're currently seeing, as your headline says, the double whammy, if you will, of rising costs and unpredictable delays. Kind of a nightmare situation in a way.
Yeah.
So help us set the table just by understanding kind of what is the current situation in terms of shipping and logistics, and then maybe we could talk about how we see that evolving.
Absolutely. So I'm sure it's not going to be a huge surprise to most people on the line that the price of shipping globally has gone through the roof. I mean, just skyrocketed.
Impressive.
What you see, yeah, it is, and it's not just a COVID thing, right? I mean, if you look at this timeline, basically what we've laid out here is a global container freight index produced by a company called Freightos. This is the Freightos Baltic Index, and you'll see that actually throughout the beginning of COVID or the COVID period, if you will, prices stayed. I mean, they were elevated. Certainly, but I mean, relative to recent numbers have stayed or were relatively low. And the prices really since Q4 of last year have just taken off. It's unbelievable. And to make matters worse, and due to similar factors, we've seen containers being bumped across shipping lines, across ports. We're just seeing a lot of confusion around logistics of getting items from one place to another. To give you a sense of what this looks like, we've taken data from a company called Ocean Insights, who measure rollover ratios. And this is rollover ratio basically means the percent of cargo that leaves a transshipment port on a different vessel than originally scheduled. Look at how the rollover ratios have changed across container lines, across ports, between January of last year and January of this year. Almost across the board, there's been a massive uptick as containers get bumped. I mean, in some cases it's worse than others, right? But I mean, look at Singapore and look at Port Klang in Malaysia. That's outside of KL. I mean, there are real challenges right now associated with getting your products to your customer on the timeline that you had initially anticipated.
And these rollover ratios are essentially an indication of delay, right? It's basically saying that it's almost, if you look at Malaysia, it's almost taking twice as long. Is that a way to read it?
So actually, it is an indication of delay, but here's what makes this particularly interesting. It's not a one-to-one indication of delay for a couple of reasons. First of all, because the containers can sit in port for quite a while before they ship. And secondly, because these can build on one another if you're moving across ports. I don't have the data in here or slide in here, but I mean, delays in terms of days have risen by an even greater margin than the numbers you see here.
Okay. And during our executive meeting last week, you asked client executives about their biggest pain points from these recent issues. And I thought the findings there were quite interesting as well. There's a lot of pain points. They could choose all of the above, they really would, but what did you learn?
That's right. Well, we asked about the greatest pain points, and they answered. We heard about problems with cost structure, delays, making demand planning difficult, difficulties in explaining this to customers, managing customer relationships, getting key inputs, et cetera. And so everybody answered. And what we really learned from this is not so much, I mean, uncertainty making demand planning more challenging was the one that came out on top. But what we really learned was that there's a lot of pain and it's spread wide, because a chorus went up afterwards and said, we really wish you'd added all of the above. We would have chosen all of the above if that had been an option.
Yeah. So understanding that and the pain points, that leads to the next question, which is how long do you see this lasting? Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, you've created a framework, as we often do, to help our clients understand this, both from the demand and the supply side. So maybe you could start with the framework, try to explain this calculus on the page for us, and then let's explain the framework. Start with demand, and then we can come back around and talk about supply.
Yeah, so I appreciate you all letting me indulge my inner economist on this one by drawing out a supply-demand chart. I was hearkening back to microeconomics here and all these lovely curves. Basically, the reason that we're seeing shipping costs and bottlenecks intensify so suddenly and so aggressively is because we see factors on the demand and the supply side moving all in the same direction, which is to drive prices up. We've outlined here 7 to 8 factors specifically. I say 7 to 8 because there's a last item here that is arguable, that some people will aggressively argue for and others will aggressively argue against. But look, the bottom line here is there's a lot going on both sides, and understanding those drivers is important to determining how long this is going to last. So Rich, as you said, let's start on the demand side. We've got 4 drivers here listed out, along with detailed strength and how long they're going to last. I'll just go through them real quick in the interest of time. So basically, the first item, consumers, particularly in the developed world, who are locked down, who can't spend money going out to eat, on trips, on services writ large, they've diverted some of their spending to goods, and particularly to purchases of durables for homes. This has been a very strong effect, and we expect to see it begin to draw down as the vaccine rollouts proceed, particularly in markets like the United States and in markets across Western Europe. Similarly, but in a slightly different vein, we saw this uptake in goods outstrip expectations. So basically last year, when the pandemic hit, a lot of companies dramatically cut back their orders. Said, we don't know how long this is going to last. We got to account for a potential drop in demand. And then demand came roaring back in Q3 and Q4, much more aggressively than so many of the multinationals with global supply chains anticipated. And so they've been struggling to keep up. Their inventories were drawn down actively, and now they're trying to restock. But they're trying to restock at a time when it's really hard to do that. Shipping costs have gone through the roof, and delays are ever present. Also a really challenging dynamic to manage. Then you also have stimulus deferred purchases, right? Governments are pumping money into their economies. Not everybody, but I would just note the US is about to pump a huge amount of money into the economy. This is going to spur government purchases, spur consumer purchases. That effect will diminish over time, but it's real. And it's something that is quite top of mind right now. And then finally, demand for medical equipment. I mean, look, you need PPE, you need vaccines shipped somehow, right? That is taking up space in containers, in planes. It's going to last for a while. So that's also creating bottlenecks.
All right, and then what about on the supply side quickly?
Yeah, so supply side, okay, briefly. COVID-related restrictions, particularly in ports, are creating challenges. I mean, you've got safe distancing measures, reducing staffing in ports, testing for truck drivers leading to congestion. We do see this drawing down as frontline workers are vaccinated, but it's going to take a while. There is a lack of containers and ships, allegedly. We'll get into this later. Containers are in short supply, so the cost of space on containers is at a premium. This is going to take a little bit of time to balance out. There are also problems with containers being in the wrong place in the world relative to where ideally you'd like them. It's a complex situation that is going to take a little time to work through. Limited capacity on shipping alternatives. This would be okay if you could move a lot of the containers by road or by rail, by air. Road or rail, there's already kind of limited capacity there. But air, for some companies, it would have been a much more legitimate and realistic option, except that with passenger flight volumes so low, there's just not a lot of space available. Market coordination, really briefly, there are a lot of executives who feel like the shipping companies are colluding. And it's not just not just multinationals outside the shipping industry who think that. The shipping companies in many cases are under investigation from authorities, regulatory authorities in the United States and China and the EU and other markets. This one's tough to say. It's tough to say whether it's happening. It's tough to say how long it's going to last, but it is something that comes up consistently.
Based on, if I kind of read through the various lines on the supply and demand side, there's nothing here that says that this is going to let up before the end of this year. I mean, everything is kind of Q2 to Q4 timeframe before you start to see things letting up a bit, it seems like. You also asked our executives their opinion of how long it would last, and maybe quickly tell us what that polling question gave us.
Yeah, so when I talked to executives during the pre-wires, a lot of them gave me timelines like, I'm hopeful it'll only be 3 or 4 months, maybe 5. And so I thought, oh, well, let's give them a full range of options for 2019. No, they were just telling me their hopes and their dreams. When we asked them what they actually thought, how long it would actually take, what we heard loud and clear was Q4 of this year or next year. Fully half of the executives on the line, and this has been corroborated in individual conversations since, said next year. This is important because there's a very stark difference between the approach that you want to take if shipping costs are going to remain elevated and bottlenecks are going to remain in place for the next couple of months versus the rest of this year. It's time to plan for this to take at least 6 to 9 months, potentially longer.
And natural impact of when you see this type of situation of delays and increased costs, that usually ripples through to pricing. And so, what do you think about our clients' ability to raise prices and pass on some of the cost increases to their customers? And does it have a difference sector by sector?
This is a really hard question to answer. Because at the end of the day,
that's why I get to ask the question. So
that's right. Okay, so ultimately, capacity for a company to pass on. So we all understand the drive to pass on prices. That's pretty clear based on the numbers that we've seen. But the capacity to pass on prices is also based on your customers' willingness to accept those price increases, the elasticity of demand. And so, to try to get our heads around this, there's not a lot of great data on pricing that's available by market on a consistent basis, certainly not by product segment. But to try to get a sense of what this looked like, we actually went to the OECD. And we looked at business confidence and consumer confidence indices across major markets around the world. So you'll see here we've got China, the US, the Euro 19. We included the OECD, which admittedly includes the US and the Euro 19, but also includes a variety of other major markets around the world to get a sense of what end demand looks like and what sentiment looks like. And what we've seen is that while business confidence has bounced back in recent months, consumer confidence has not. Consumer confidence has remained quite subdued, really near levels that we saw at the base or at the bottom, the trough of the COVID dip. You may look at China's numbers and go, light green or light blue line is kind of wonky. What's going on there? It looks okay. The numbers for China are a little bit strange. Personally, I think they have to do with some sort of methodological shifts that took place several years ago. But regardless of all of that, we can normalize for that and by offering a slightly different lens, which is to look at the spread between consumer and business confidence. Right, so we basically just subtracted one from the other. And what we see here very clearly is that across major developed Western markets, major developed markets, actually, across the world, Western and Eastern, that businesses are much more confident than end consumers are. And the same thing is true for China. Consumer confidence levels remain relatively low. Now, this is notable. I should note, caveat, the US stimulus will probably bump up the US's number here, so that'll be good. But the question is by how much? And to what degree is the US going to be able to carry the rest of the world? We see potential here for pushback from end consumers. And this includes governments in many parts of the world as well, who are going to be dealing with limited fiscal space, which basically means that companies are going to be caught in a bit of a squeeze, right? They're going to face increased cost pressures from their suppliers, increased pushback from their customers, and you're going to see price pressures ripple back and forth through the supply chain. Now, this will all ripple all the way back to raw material producers as well. So this isn't a static system. It's a very dynamic system. But companies are really going to have to work through some challenging gray area and manage some challenging or difficult negotiations with limited data to go off of globally, which is one of the reasons why this is an item that we're going to be actively monitoring. I know we're running up on time, so just really quickly, with regards to end customer segments or to variation across segments, you are going to see some variation, or you're likely to. So anyone with priority access to containers, companies shipping critical medication, supplies, vaccines in the healthcare space, they're probably not going to feel this as acutely and be able to manage this pressure more actively. Companies serving low-income consumers who've been really hit hard are probably going to face more pressure here, pushback, than those serving high-income consumers. Same thing with governments. Governments with plenty of fiscal space probably aren't going to push back as hard. Governments with less fiscal space, they'll push back.
Great. And Adam, just as we wrap up here, I just wanted to conclude with some of the key actions that we recommend clients are taking. And we have, and we share, we go deeper when we do briefings for clients on these and also in our research, but there's 9 specific actions. We won't be able to go through these, but in the materials that we send around afterwards, you'll be able to dive into this. But is there anything that jumps out that you'd want to highlight as kind of a closing comment? Because it is important that we help our clients really think about what all this means in terms of actions.
Sure. So there's a lot here. Not everything here will apply to everybody, but from our perspective, there are say 2 or 3 that would probably highlight just to wrap us up. The first one is the upper left-hand corner of this slide. Align with corporate on timelines for the easing of elevated shipping costs and bottlenecks to inform broader market strategy. If this is something that's going to last till Q4 of this year or likely into next year, then you'll want to make sure that you and corporate or that everyone across your organization is aligned about that and is building strategy with that in mind. If one part of the organization thinks it's going to ease up in the next 3 months and another is thinking out to next year, you're going to end up with very, very different ideas about what should be done. So it's very important to align on this front.
Yeah, and you can use the materials to help do that. Yep.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can also bring us in as a third party, just to offer unbiased views, as well as executive voice from different companies. Secondly, I guess I'd point your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. Once again, if in fact we're looking at this lasting an extended period of time, then it's really important for you to think about your product portfolio and how you're managing it, managing production, delivery. We would recommend that you seriously look for potential substitutions if they're available to try to get around these bottlenecks, which are going to last for quite some time. If you have pre-approved substitutions, go for it. Otherwise, look for potential substitutions. And in some cases, if you can't find them, evaluate your product portfolio to identify offerings that you can temporarily remove or suspend to simplify your supply chain management without unduly impacting your revenues.
Okay, great. And a lot of other good content here. And again, Adam, thank you so much. This has been excellent, insightful, challenging at times, which I appreciate your willingness to handle some of the tougher questions. And I really want to thank our listeners for their questions they submitted and for sticking with us through this. I think we could keep going for a long time. So we've covered a lot of ground. I encourage all of those listeners to read the analysis, schedule briefings with Adam and the team on these topics, given their importance. And as a reminder, if you're a Frontier View client, you can speak to Adam or any member of the Frontier View Asia Pacific research team at any time by scheduling time through your client relationship director. And all of our research and data and analyst insights are available and always updated on the Frontier View desktop and mobile application, including this really cool COVID recovery timeline hub that we created that's constantly being updated with our latest thinking. So thank you all again. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you, Adam, again, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon. And we wish you all be safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.